Hey everybody, welcome to the show this week, Eternal Return. Doesn't get more important than this, the culmination of Nietzsche's philosophy, the Übermensch's code of ethics. This is it. This is what all of his philosophy built up to, yet I think we're a little bit too blasé about this. Oh, Eternal Return, oh, so the same thing happens over and over? That doesn't really make any sense. Whatever, let's move on to something with supposedly more meat to it. But I think when we understand Eternal Return, or just return, Eternal Return, a little bit redundant, when we understand the return in its proper context, then I think it does start to make more sense, and we can really see how impactful it is. Maybe not philosophically impactful, but psychologically, I think this is a very important topic to understand. Right? I mean, Nietzsche was essentially a psychologist. He was not so much a philosopher. Yeah, Eternal Return, a little bit of a novice point philosophically. Well, it's not novice if you're a teenager. If you're a teenager and reading thus folks Zarathustra, then you think it's the biggest deal in the world. Philosophically, but psychologically, I do think that this is important. There are lots of great information here. So let's get to it. First things first, animusempire.com/schedule. If you just want to reach out and talk with somebody about what's going on with you for half an hour, this is what we're here for. animusempire.com/schedule, free 30-minute consultations. Overview. Part 1 will be probably the most important part, is understanding the context of the Eternal Return. Well, no, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 will all be about context. Part 4 will get into the Eternal Return. It just doesn't even sound right to say. Return. It's the return. And then Part 5 will be examples and takeaways, really driving this point home. I remember talking about this. I took a 19th century philosophy class in college. Or no, I think it was just a class on existentialism. And we barely spent 5 minutes on the return. And I didn't get it at the time, because we only spent 5 minutes on it. But then when I went back and read more about it, did my own research on it, I thought this is a really big deal, actually. That somebody would think about ethics from this perspective. But I think it took the perspective of the 19th century to do this. We will get to it. All right, so Part 1. Context. Well, a couple of misconceptions about the return is that it's nihilism. Look, we do the same thing over and over, and it doesn't change. Just like we live the same life over and over, or history keeps repeating itself over and over, and part of what the Übermensch would do in this misconception of it is accept this and essentially not do anything about it. You rise above it. You rise above this nihilism by recognizing it for what it is. I think this is a very narrow-minded view of what the return is, and I guess we'll talk about exactly why that is. Another misconception of it, well, not so much a misconception, but another narrow view, is that, so I guess these aren't really misconceptions. That this is just narrow ways of thinking about this, because I don't even think the nihilism point is a misconception. Nietzsche is saying that we do the same thing over and over again. From a certain context, that's what he's saying, but that's not all he's saying. He's saying so much more. This wouldn't be the Übermensch's code, right? Nietzsche's ultimate man, the Übermensch. Not only are you a mensch, but you're an Übermensch. This wouldn't be the Übermensch's ultimate code of ethics if it was just, we do the same thing over and over again. Yeah, that's part of it. And part of it is to recognize that, but there's way more to it. Another narrow view of it is it's a way out of good versus evil thinking, which is true. I think that's also the point of Eternal Return. But that's only part of it. I think to really understand return, we need to understand its context. That's what most of this presentation, most of this show is going to be. Presentation on YouTube show if you're just listening to the audio. But I'm going to really do my best, if you're just listening to the audio, to explain the slides as I'm going through them. But Nietzsche is the first philosopher since Darwin. So I'm going to come at this from a Darwinian interpretation, and Nietzsche was definitely influenced by Darwin. And I'm also going to come at it from the perspective of eternal return is a precursor to individuation, to Jung's individuation. And this isn't just the connections I'm making over here with my tinfoil hat, Jung explicitly points to the return as his model for individuation. See, what we get wrong about individuation is we think it's just about, just becoming your own person. And that is part of it. Becoming your own person, developing your own identity, that's definitely a part of it. But the misconception about that is, the truth about individuation is really becoming who you are while at the same time recognizing how much you are just like everybody else. So from a Jungian perspective, he would say, we all have these same archetypes. We all have these universal experiences, these universal ways of looking at the world. How are you going to live out these archetypes? You're going to take the same information everybody else has and make your own thing with it. Jung would say, look, you're in this art class and the art supplies are limited. You all have just 9 colors and the same paint. The same paint, the same paintbrushes, the same canvas, the 9 colors. These are the archetypes, but you can do something with it. Individuation isn't, I'm going to start sculpting. No, you can't do that. And I think this is what the return is about. We're going to get to it. But it makes sense that there's these misconceptions about it. Here's a quotation from Zarathustra, part 3. This is a long quotation, but I think this is the only quotation. This is the only quotation in the presentation. So this is from Zarathustra, part 3, the Walter Kaufmann translation, the only translation of Nietzsche that you need to read. And Zarathustra, says this. From this moment, an eternal lane leads backwards. Behind us lies an eternity. Must not whatever can walk have walked on this lane before? Must not whatever can have happened has happened? Have been done, have passed by before. And if everything has been there before, what do you think, dwarf, of this moment? By the way, Zarathustra's talking to a dwarf here. It's supposed to represent a part of Zarathustra that he's arguing away. It doesn't really matter. But he's talking to a dwarf. What do you think, dwarf, of this moment? Must not this gateway too have been there before? This gateway meaning this time and place. Must not all of us have been there before, and return and walk in that other lane out there before us in this long, dreadful lane? Must not we eternally return? So this sounds nuts. But look, Nietzsche was no idiot. I think a lot of people with a 130 IQ think, I'm too smart for this world. There's no way I can get along because everybody else is such an idiot. No, if you have a 130 IQ, you're not too smart for this world. If you're Nietzsche and whatever his IQ was, you probably are. You probably can start to use that excuse when your IQ gets up to the level of Nietzsche's IQ. So what does he really mean here? This is not some stupid guy just saying something to say it. I think he's talking about something very specific here. He's talking about a way of looking at the world, a way of looking at your own psychology that can be really helpful. That can be so helpful that he would ascribe it as the final code, the ethical code of this final iteration of humanity, this Übermensch. So look, we can understand why there are misconceptions about this, because if you just read this without any context, you go, this guy's nuts anyway. Moving on to a more well-defined ethical code. Let's read Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle talks about how to have friends. Maybe that's more useful. I think this is more useful again when we put it in context. The theme of the week, the theme of this episode is context. And I also think it's important to talk about the return because it encapsulates many of Nietzsche's ideas. Which makes sense. I mean, if it's the culmination of his philosophy, it's going to encapsulate all of his previous ideas. I mean, it's going to include slave versus master morality. It's going to include will to power. We'll talk about that. It's going to include the idea that God is dead and what that means. Apollo versus Dionysus. Another way, the way out of nihilism. I mean, right, that was Nietzsche's point about Apollo versus Dionysus. Seemingly, there's this nihilism in us because we have these inherently conflicting parts, which the Greeks recognized as the birth of tragedy. Which I have read part of, I will say, but I think it's the only one of Nietzsche's books that I haven't really read. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think there's a lot more other letters and things, but Doesn't matter. You know, obviously this is going to also encapsulate the Übermensch because it is the Übermensch code. So yeah, I'm just going to throw a bunch of concepts at you, I think, and yeah, I think we'll explain what the return is anyway. And I think another reason why I think this is important is our failure to understand Nietzsche makes it difficult to understand Nietzsche. Nietzsche warns us about certain biases we're going to get to in the next section. Prejudices that we may have, and how these prejudices may influence our thinking. And it's exactly because we have these prejudices makes it more difficult to understand what Nietzsche's talking about. So let's try to look at the return stripped away from our preconceived notions, our biases, our prejudices. You know, like we come at Nietzsche with our typical Judeo-Christian Marxist bias. Either collectivism is good or you can't have an ego. So when we see somebody talking about an Übermensch code, somebody effectively saying having a big ego, having a big sense of yourself, which is believe it or not, that's what I think we're going to get to with that quotation from a couple slides ago about Zarathustra. Somebody who has a big sense of himself, all we can do is see that as narcissism or totalitarianism or some kind of bully, but that's definitely not what Nietzsche was talking about, not at all. It may be about being more reality-oriented and what we need to do to ourselves to become more reality-oriented. It's like you can't see it because your issues prevent you from... Yeah, the issues that Nietzsche is warning us about prevent us from seeing what he's really talking about. It's like when... Yeah, a great example is when I'm talking to MGTOW guys. And I think, well, maybe woman isn't the enemy because... Look, once you work on yourself... Once you get your own identity figured out, then women are a natural part of your life. Maybe they're not the leader in your life. I know you need to project out that worldview as a defense against the fact that you haven't had a girlfriend for the past 5.5 years. But you have to develop a boundary to see it. And they say, well, no, look, women are the enemy. Look at this one thing they did bad. And I say, yeah, that's the result because you haven't developed a boundary, right? I'm the thing that's keeping them from seeing the truth is the exact thing that I'm warning them about. I also see this, like whenever I say that guys need to talk more about emotions, I know a lot of guys see that as, so you want me to be weak? You want me to be a wuss? Well, I don't want to talk about my past. Why would I talk about my dad? I don't want to complain about my dad. Yeah, see, you're conflating talking about your dad and your issues with him as complaining about your dad. What if those are two completely different issues? No, I understand where my dad was coming from. It's fine. He had his own issues. It's not going to help to go back and rehash those. Even the interpretation, which I think is correct, my dad tried his best. He did the best that he could. What good could possibly come from talking about those issues? Well, geez, dude, I don't know. I mean, what if a crane fell on your leg? What would you say? Oh, well, they probably tried to build the crane as best they could. No use going back and thinking about it. Yeah, but you still have this damaged leg. It's not about the crane anymore. It's about your issue with the crane. It's about your damaged leg. You reach. And to be fair, again, Nietzsche didn't write systematically, so it makes sense that there would be misconceptions or at least narrow views. I mean, his, this is especially made evident in Human All Too Human. He just wrote a bunch of aphorisms, and he kind of put them together in context as it starts to make sense. But, the message I don't think is that evident. But I think it does start to make more sense when you understand that Nietzsche was an existentialist. He was a call. We'll get to it in the next section. He was essentially telling people, hey, philosophy is getting too wacky. Let's get back to reality. However wacky Zarathustra is, arguing with a dwarf, and at least I'm trying to get more in touch with reality. So the return is not some mystical woo-woo, wouldn't it be weird if every cell was a universe with an unknown cell? Like one of those dorm room freshman year kind of conversations. It's much more real than this. But we can understand why there are misconceptions, because not the most systematic guy, but yeah, you have to read it all as a whole and then take it in and kind of interpret it. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this useful because I think, if nothing else, even if this entire presentation is a bunch of BS and a lot of my projection onto Nietzsche, even if that does end up being the case, I still think we can make the return really useful and applicable to your life. And I also think the return is important because it encompasses the psychological issue. How do we get out of our isolation and the narcissism that causes the isolation and the narcissism that perpetuates the isolation? Same thing with the MGTOW guy I was talking about, the boundary, or some guy talking about his issues with his father, right? The narcissism keeps us isolated. The isolation leads to narcissism. We need to get out of this loop somehow. Paradoxically, by discussing a philosophy that seems to end up in going around in a loop. But I think this is why a lot of, especially young men, are attracted to Nietzsche, even if they don't know exactly what he's talking about. I mean, my favorite analogy here, the starving children in Africa and Haiti, what do? They just start eating clay. Like, why are you eating clay? And then you analyze the clay, and there's actually helpful minerals in the clay for them to eat. And you go, like, did you sense this? Are you sensing the healthy minerals in Nietzsche? Because you understand this is exactly what your issue is. And even if you don't understand it explicitly, you get that this guy has a solution. And I think Nietzsche does have a solution. Oh yeah, this slide just says Walter Kaufman. Get the Walter Kaufman translation. They're the most popular ones. It's just recognize that this is the translations. So that's what the quotation is from anyway. All right, so part 2. Let's deal with the will to power and how this is going to relate with the return. Like I said, we're just going to lay a bunch of pieces out here and then put them together at the end. So will to power, this is a concept that Nietzsche got from first Schopenhauer and then the Greeks. And at first, yes, the typical interpretation of the will to power was Nietzsche's original iteration of that concept. And this is what he talks about in Birth of Tragedy. Like a will to have literal power over people. Like, people will develop a philosophy simply to have power, like physical might, kind of Roman power. But it became much more subtle. I mean, Nietzsche's philosophy totally changed after Birth of Tragedy, so it's very difficult to... I mean, he does lay out some fundamental conflicts in that book, but his philosophy becomes much more nuanced later on, and there's Zarathustra and definitely in Beyond Good and Evil. I mean, that's the one to read. But all he's saying, this isn't will to power over other people necessarily, or will to fascism, or will to exterminate the Jews, nothing like that. It's just we are simply controlled by unconscious biases and drives. So when we think we're employing reason, what could be happening, perhaps, is we're just rationalizing what we want to be true. Now, maybe this doesn't seem like that big a deal now, but this was a huge deal to Nietzsche. And ultimately what he was doing was trying to get back to reality, existentialism, the philosophy for existence, getting back in touch with existence. So what this really was is a critique of idealism. So really, to understand will to power, we need to understand two idealists. Well, one idealist and then another who took the person who wasn't really an idealist and then turned it into idealism. So the first one was Immanuel Kant. And he was very explicit about his bias, which is probably where Nietzsche got this idea. So even though Kant may have been wrong, I think this was also one of the seeds of the idea of will to power. And Kant came out and said, I want to limit reason to make room for faith. That is a direct quotation. So he created a philosophy where, I mean, on the surface, he was trying to reconcile rationalism with empiricism. Goes back to what we were talking about a couple weeks ago with the two main philosophies behind introversion and extroversion, right? Realism and nominalism. How do we reconcile these two? Kant's answer was to say that, well, there are things that we cannot really know in themselves. We can see the surface of a thing, but then there's the thing in itself, and we can't really see that. Because of our sense perceptions, because of our five senses, we can't really see what a thing is in itself. What this is, in a sense, is a fallacy of begging the question. It doesn't really solve the problem between empiricism and rationalism. He just pushes the question back. Very similar. It's just like, well, the split doesn't exist out there in reality, it exists in your own mind. And he famously said, we need to limit reason to make room for his faith, his Christian faith. And how do we do that? As he comes up with this complicated philosophy that says we cannot know something in itself. So if there's a limit to our reason, then we must necessarily employ faith. Now Hegel came along and used Occam's razor to simply cut out reality. I mean, if we cannot know a thing in itself, then what does reality even matter? All we have is a projection of our ideas. This is idealism. This is introversion. Hegel, a Christian, is he not just rationalizing here his Christian faith? That's what Nietzsche is arguing. Okay, so you go back to some projected thing out there from which everything emanates. Well, now this is just rehashed Neoplatonism. We're back to where Plotinus was 2,000 years ago. Right? I mean, this is during the Enlightenment, I guess, but this is pro-Christian, anti-Enlightenment philosophy. So here we have two famous philosophers, philosophers from which a lot of our modern philosophy is based. Like, you guys want to understand where the SJW, postmodernism, Foucault thing. I mean, people always criticize Foucault. Like, I agree way more with Foucault and Derrida than I do with Kant and Hegel. They were just using critical theory as an epistemological device. What Kant and Hegel were saying is, no, this is real. This is how reality really is. Well, how it really is we can't know it. Well, isn't that amenable to the Christian ethic? What is real? Just Christianity. We're using philosophy. We're using philosophy to denigrate philosophy so we can go back to the Christianity we were raised with. That is what Nietzsche is accusing these two guys. He accuses way more people, but these are the two perpetrators that he points to. So what are some examples of this? Well, there's a bunch, and we'll get to it just so we understand. But, my favorite one is our views on prostitution throughout the ages. Consistently, throughout cultures. Who are the two groups of people that have been routinely pro-prostitution, pro-legalizing prostitution? High-status men and low-status women. Interesting, isn't it? Great for high-status men because they have enough money to pay for prostitutes. Great for low-status women because now they have they can have their pretty woman fantasy. Now, who are the two groups of people who have been routinely against prostitution? Low-status men and high-status women. Now, low-status men wouldn't like prostitution because, you're taking all of our future girlfriends and wives away. High-status women wouldn't like it because their husbands are paying for sex. Now, this doesn't explain everything, right? This doesn't explain all of our views on prostitution, but isn't it interesting, across culture, across time, these are the two groups of people, and the group of people that has been mostly in favor of prostitution and the group that has been mostly against it. This is your will to power coming out. You're not really reasoning. You're not really in touch with reality. You think you are. Really what you're trying to do is rationalize away your insecurities. You want the world to be how you want it to be, and that's what you use your, quote, reason to do. Now, what would Kant say? He's like, well, this is just what we do. There's no way out of this. Nietzsche, the existentialist, is at least saying, well, there's a way out of this. I can look at these patterns, but I can also see a way out of this, which makes Nietzsche more of a psychologist than a philosopher. So we also see will to power and charity. Why do we want, does it make sense to go to a charity function, to dress up in a tuxedo to go to a charity function and have a dinner? Why does that make any sense? Why wouldn't you just give money to poor people? No, you do charity because you want to look awesome. What do you think you're doing? Why would you put so much time into that? What about politics? That study that came out a couple years ago, I don't know how real it is, but geez, it kind of makes sense to me. bicep size predicts political views. I mean, now we have all these Chad soy memes. Can you kind of just tell somebody's political views by looking at them? But most of the time you can. 80-85% of the time you pretty much can. What about incels? And the rage that they feel. And their commandments on society and how society should operate. Well, what are they really saying? What they're saying is, look, if society operated the way we think it should, then it would be better for us. I mean, this is our views on sex, and another way of saying it is, typically, I mean, yeah, why would, it's not just incels, like, why would the 300-pound feminist want call all sex with men rape? That's second wave feminism. That's Susan Estridge, Hillary Clinton. Why would they think that all sex with men is rape? Well, because why? Isn't it obvious? And pity. You think when you're having pity for somebody, you're being nice to them. But really it's a way to bestow your self-contempt onto others. This is your way of having power over somebody else. Because what do I say about pity is essentially saying, if I was in your situation, there's nothing I would be able to do to change this. Now again, as I said, this isn't definite. That Nietzsche isn't saying that the will to power is definite, that it's inherently going to control us. There's a way out of this. And the way out of this is the return. Right? Kant would say there's no way out of this. Hegel would say there's no way out of this. Nietzsche is saying there is a way out of this. This is why Nietzsche is not a precursor to critical theory. Well, no, Nietzsche is. Because critical theory is really just a epistemological device. Now, what people have taken with critical theory and turned it into this religion, then that's wasn't the original intent of Derrida and Foucault. But yeah, Nietzsche is a precursor to critical theory. Yes, what it strictly means. Kant and Hegel, paradoxically, the two Christian philosophers, they are a precursor to the SJW fourth wave feminism thing going on right now. They're both anti-enlightenment. I know we separate these two things in our minds when we think they're totally separate. No, they're the same thing, because you're both just denying reality in a little bit different ways. On the surface, it looks a little bit different, but it's both a denial of reality. So I don't know how obvious this seems to us, but he's just saying that beliefs not necessarily the truth. We have beliefs because we want them to be true. We are, in a sense, creating a world with our beliefs. A world in which we would be more likely to be comfortable. And Nietzsche is challenging us to take apart each of our beliefs and see whether we really think it's true. He's not denying that truth exists. He's an existentialist. But he's challenging us to take apart our beliefs and to see, do I really believe this because it's true or because it makes me comfortable? Nietzsche is also often characterized as a subjectivist, and clearly, I mean, if you just look at that one quotation from Zarathustra that I read before, then it would seem like he maybe would be a subjectivist, but that's not what's going on here. And I think when we look at Nietzsche as a subjectivist, we completely, lose all the great lessons from the return. I had another point to say there, I forget. Yeah, some is we have biases. This is the point. Again, this is obvious now, but it wasn't back in the 19th century. All right, so part 3, morality. Since we are dealing with the Übermensch code, we are dealing with morality. Let's look at what morality is and how we use it. Well, there's 3 stages of moral development according to Nietzsche. The first is the pre-moral, second is the moral, and the third is the extra-moral. It's not always translated that way, but that's what I'll just say for now. And the pre-moral is simply judging action by its consequences. I mean, this is consequentialism, this is utilitarianism. I think I talked a little bit ago about the problem with utilitarianism. Yeah, I related it back to Thanos and Avengers. I mean, he was a utilitarian. I mean, he wanted to kill half the people in the universe so to increase happiness. But what's this fallacy? Again, it's begging the question. What do you mean by happiness? So you want to increase happiness. Well, what is happiness? You want to decrease suffering. Well, what's suffering? It begs the question. You have an idea of happiness, you have an idea of suffering that you're not explicating. I mean, this is classic will to power. Yeah, so what informs your idea of happiness? I mean, this is your unconscious bias that you don't want to explicate because you're too simple-minded. It's just crazy. Am I the only one going nuts? It just seems crazy to me. We live in this world where we go watch Avengers and we look at what Thanos is doing. Oh yeah, that's really bad. But then we turn around and do effective altruism. What? Why effective altruism? I just want to create the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Yeah, what's good? What does that mean? Maybe what you think is going to be good for somebody in Africa isn't really good. On the surface, it looks good. But what's really going on? What's really the good? You're not pushing the question back far enough. You're begging the question. And so the moral stage of development is a little bit better. You just place the judgment of the action by its conscious intent. And I mean, is it any question why, this is rationalism, this is realism, what we were talking about, the philosophy of Jungian types. In a philosophy, disconnected from reality, right? That's what realism is. That's what realism and rationalism is. It's truth without reality. Then invariably you end up with intention ethics. It's all about the intention. It's not like the intention isn't part of ethics, clearly. That definitely plays a role, but is that everything? Nietzsche thinks to go beyond this, we have to look at the extramoral. So all the analysis that we put on the consequence of the action and the conscious intent, we now need to take that analysis to the unconscious intent. It's really questioning our bias, turning the lens that we replace everything. Yeah, so all the work that we put in to go, what would be the best, most effective way to help this village in Africa? All the analysis we do there, because there's no way of judging that. Not without first looking at your own issues, your own bias. And this is really what he means by being an Übermensch and having an ego. But of course, from our typical Christian Marxist ethic, we go, an ethical code about egoism. Well, that must be bad. What are you, some kind of tyrant? Some kind of bully? Oh, so you just want to go around stepping on people? When does Nietzsche say that? That isn't in The Birth of Tragedy, perhaps. But if you're quoting The Birth of Tragedy to prove that point, you just don't understand the context. Maybe that's Nietzsche's fault for being unclear, but maybe that's your fault for being stupid. And you probably heard of this before. There's master and slave morality. Again, we're just putting the pieces together so the eternal return, when we do analyze it, will simply make more sense. Master morality, skill, strength, intelligence, really what it's characterized by you have your aggression and you direct it out in the world. Yeah, it's a very this world philosophy. Or this world ethics, excuse me. Take your aggression and make it useful in the world. Now again, if you interpreted that from the Marxist, Christian, collectivist, otherworldly perspective, you go, oh, well, how could you use your aggression in a useful way? And then there's slave morality, faith, meekness, slovenliness, and aggression directed inward, which is sadness. Pity, but it doesn't matter because you're not living for this world anyway, so what's the big deal, right? You're denying all these things in this world so you can reach some perceived other Eden. And clearly we're seeing another modern day slave revolt in the, it's not SJWs. I mean, this is just the iteration of a long line of things, but in Marxist philosophy for the past 150 years. And it makes sense. There was the first slave revolt in the Roman Empire when people put values on skill, strength, and intelligence. So what happened in the 17th and 18th centuries? 16th, 17th, 18th centuries of the Enlightenment. We started to get back to a this world philosophy. Some people are being shown to be better than others. We can't have that. So let's have another slave revolt. These things naturally happen because of the will to power. Religious. What is religious? It's will to power expressed as meekness and humility. When you say it's good to be meek and humble, all you're saying is, boy, I would sure do a lot better in a world where everybody was meek and humble because I don't perceive myself to have any real strength or skill or intelligence. So everybody just go around acting meek and humble so I feel better. It's no different than, the Roman soldier who's flexing his muscles and saying, hey, look at all these guys I killed. It's the same thing. Maybe one's a little bit more explicit, but it's the same thing. So how do we remove this unconscious bias? That's really what the return is about. Solitude. Challenge yourself, but why? Why would you need solitude, and why would you need to challenge yourself? I mean, this could have been an entire section, but yeah, we're already going too long, so I had to cut this part out. But, Nietzsche had a view on races. And he didn't talk about races like we mean like a race of people today, like Caucasian, Black, or Asian. He's talking about countries of people and how different countries seem to develop different qualities. The people in these countries develop different qualities. He saw some were masculine, some were feminine. German people he thought were masculine. Jews he thought were masculine. Italians, Greeks were more feminine. And this makes sense because we pass our genes onto our progeny. So if any of these personality traits are in fact genetic, and guess what? They are, then wouldn't it make sense that we are, in a sense, bestowing our genetics, we are, in a sense, bestowing our personality onto the next generation. Okay, now we're getting a little bit more into the return, but it's the next section. But the problem is, now, this slave revolt happened 2,000 years ago, so it's been, 40, 50 generations of slaves mating, of slaves passing on their slave morality, which is at least in part genetic, which it is. Now, Nietzsche wasn't really clear how much of it was genetic, but clearly he thought some of it was in part genetic, and maybe to a nihilistic extent. I mean, he definitely says that, some people are just so far in the slave morality, like they have no chance of getting out. But they do have a chance of their progeny getting out, again, going back to the eternal return. Now, I don't think that's true. But look, I mean, now we're living in this world of 2,000 years into this world where guys who would have been kicked out of Sparta, who would have been killed before they reached adolescence, now are allowed to live to maturity and breed. So why would we have to isolate ourselves? Why would we have to put ourselves in solitude? Isolate and solitude, those are two different things. Solitude is not necessarily isolation. Isolation is psychologically removing yourself from the world, avoiding issues, turning in on yourself, avoiding reality. Solitude, Nietzsche saw as a way of confronting reality, which I really think it is. He wasn't just talking about solitude as important, but more important is challenge yourself. Challenge yourself specifically, more than society demands that you challenge yourself. Why? Right? Because you're living in this society of slaves. Now, maybe it doesn't seem like slavery to you, but it is. If you don't think it's slavery, then Nietzsche would challenge you. Well, you're just too in the slave mentality to see, which is even more of a reason why you really need to start putting yourself in solitude to work on your issues and challenge yourself. All right, then this is a great segue into the return. The Übermensch Code, what we're really talking about here. Here's one foundational premise behind the return that kind of covered before, again, but it's just to put it in a little bit different way, putting pieces together again. And one of the founding principles is we live out the same program in various ways. Again, to understand the return, we need to understand to the extent that Nietzsche was influenced by Darwinian theory. We are an effect of past generations, of the past 40 generations of slaves mating. But in that same vein, like, we also bestow our chemicals, our genes, onto future generations. So in a sense, we are part of this long road that has continued on in the past and will continue on into the future. It's not just about us. Like when you think you're turning your aggression inward, even if you know it's wrong, you think that's just about you. It's not about you. I mean, it is about you, but it's much bigger than that. If we look at human life through Darwinian theory, I mean, we see that our lives are so much bigger than our own. Really what the return is it's a call for perspective. It's a call for looking at yourself as part of this long chain of events and being one link in this chain into the future, which not necessarily determined, but for a lot of people it is. And he's just challenging us to wake up from seeing it as predetermined. Another foundation is archetypes. And this I go back to what Jung was talking about, and this is where he got the idea of his individuation from in archetypes. I mean, all an archetype is, to put it simply, is something as part of culture for such a long period of time, is it goes into our genetic code. So we are the effect of archetypes, yes, but we also create archetypes. Great example of this is how the Oedipus complex, that is an archetypal issue. I think it's the main archetypal issue that we all deal with. How well can we get along with other men as a man and impress women? Now, why is this an issue for humanity? Does this just come out of the blue? No, it's in our DNA. At some point, we became more sexually dimorphic. Now, we're not that sexually dimorphic, but we are. Men are like 10 or 15 or 20% heavier than women. That's definitely not non-zero. Now look, if gorillas had the prefrontal cortex and the cerebral cortex that we had, their Oedipus complex would be way more severe because they're more sexually dimorphic. I think men are twice as heavy. Yeah, the alpha gorilla is twice as heavy, even more than a real gorilla. I was trying to think what would happen if I got into a fight with a gorilla. These are just thoughts that I have. Adult male gorilla is 5 feet tall and 500 pounds. Could you imagine? Could you imagine coming across a guy who was 5 feet tall, 500? It just wouldn't make sense. It's just like too wide to make sense. Just all muscle. So those are two founding principles to the return. So what is the return given all this? Now, philosophically, this seems kind of silly. But psychologically, when we start challenging ourselves in this ways, we can see how important this is to view our life from this context. Live each moment as if you were going to live it forever. And Nietzsche's not posing this as like, bring as much awareness to each moment like this, or place as much emphasis on each moment, live each day to the fullest. He's not saying that as a hypothetical, as a thought experiment. He's saying, look at what's going on. This is what we really do anyways. Bring this much awareness to each one of your actions. It's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to the collectivistic, otherworldly views of Marxism and Christianity, respectively, because they're telling you to do the exact opposite. And he is living in the downfall of the Enlightenment in the 19th century. He's saying, we're doing it again. Like, let's wake the F up. This really matters. Christianity tells you, live for the other world. It doesn't matter. You just have this one life and that's it. Marxism is telling you, who are you to live for yourself anyway? Like, what does it matter? You only have value to the extent that you're part of the group. Which is, of course, what Hegel said, too. So how does this going to matter in your life? Let's look at some examples and takeaways. Well, let's get to a takeaway first. I mean, just understanding compound interest. We all understand the power of compound interest. Now, this is an equation for investors. I mean, this is for finances. Yeah, the amount equals the principal multiplied 100%, 1.00, plus the interest rate over the number of iterations, in a sense, to the power of number of iterations times time in years, or whatever time period it is. Doesn't matter. This is what he's saying. This is how we're living our lives. Like, we think it's simple interest. We think what we do affects us tomorrow, affects the next day, maybe, and it'll just, at most, affect us into our next life. But Nietzsche's saying, no. This is going to go on for eternity. Actions have compound interest. Not just for the next generation, but for your own life. I mean, in 10 years. He's trying to wake us up and say, oh, you just want to turn away. You want to avoid your neighbor. You want to avoid doing that thing that like, even if it's just sending an email, you want to avoid that. Well, that's not just an isolated incident. In 10 years, whether you send that email today in a good way or you don't send it, you're either going to be paying interest on it, right, like a debt, or you're going to be receiving interest or dividends. Clearly, I'm not a finance guy. My vocabulary here about this is being stretched. Dividends, I think that's something. Or you're going to be receiving dividends on that investment that you made. But what do? We sit around and go, oh, I'm a loser, it doesn't matter. But what's being a loser? Loser is just the principle here. That's just a multiplication. The number of iterations and the time, that's exponential. So what if you start off with a much larger principle, right? But it's just simple interest instead of compounded interest. Completely different result. We don't know that. We don't know the power. Like, what if you take a what's that one they say? What you take a newspaper and fold it in half 64 times? You'll have something that has enough thickness to reach the moon, something like that. Exactly. Oh yeah, here's an example I have. Yeah, what's 100 to the second power versus 2 to the 100th power? What's that? 10,000 versus, yeah, who freaking knows? just I mean, this is probably the number of atoms in the universe, right? What we do matters. And this isn't just feel-goodery. In fact, there's a lot of pressure on each moment. So let's bring as much freaking awareness to this as we can, because we're not just living out past lives, we're also creating the future. So this obviously applies for something like family trauma. Here you have the great scene from Dr. Sleep. Talked about that a couple weeks ago on a video. It's just, yeah. Actually, a listener recommended it, and I watched it, and very good. But this is about managing your own issues in family trauma. We all see this. When you come to the clinic to manage your own issues, you're not just managing your issues. I could pretty much assume your family, everybody in your family has this issue to varying degree. Your family has had this issue for a long period of time. Now, you're not just managing your own issue, right? You're accruing excuse me, the slave mentality of the past, but you're also bestowing or giving yourself the option to bestow it on in the future. It's like, hey, you better come into therapy and manage these issues because, yeah, it's going to affect the wife you pick. You're going to be much less likely to pick a crazy wife. You know, probably a wife like your mom. And now your son's going to be raised by this woman, and now he's going to have less of a chance of getting the issues from your mom. Now he's going to go on to make an even better decision about a wife to be made, and then an even better decision, and it just compounds. And then in 5-6 generations, right, you have no idea. That's why saying no to the alcohol isn't essentially saying no to the family issue of abuse and alcoholism, as Danny does in this, now Dan, right? He's a man. He's no longer Danny, he's Dan, as he does in this situation. By the way, I listened to a review of this video, and people are upset that this guy doesn't look exactly like Jack Nicholson. It's like who freaking cares? Like, what do you, why would you care about that anyway? And we can all make fun of this guy. This is mystery. This is the red pill before there was really a red pill. And we all make fun of him. I'll look at his stupid hat, but what he's doing is very important. And I'll always be a huge defender of mystery and guys who are just doing pickup things. Maybe this is why talking to girls is so important. Even if you have to put on a stupid hat and wear earrings and get a tattoo of a kiss on your neck. This is your initiation. If you don't, then who knows the effect that this can have? Yes, on your own life. I'm not just telling you to take yourself out of your own life, but the impact that your life has on generation after generation after generation. So if you have to dress up and do that, it's way better to do that than to sit at home and make fun of guys who do that. You can get rid of mystery, but what's going to replace it? Some guy who doesn't do anything. It's like getting rid of the aristocracy in Russia or China. Yeah, it was bad. You don't want your country to be like that, but what are you going to replace it with? MGTOW. It's either this or MGTOW. That's why this stuff is so important. That's why the decision whether to talk to a girl now. It's not just about, it's probably not going to work out. Yeah, it's probably not going to work out. It's not about that. It's about you putting yourself in the best psychological situation so you can pick a girl who's going to be better for you. But of course, in this post-Enlightenment society, who's demonized the most? Scrooge McDuck, right? I mean, this picture should really be of Gordon Gekko. but whatever. Just to know me is to know that I think it's like the 1983 rendition of Christmas Carol, Disney rendition of Christmas Carol. Yeah, that is my memoraries. Holy crap, I've seen that so many times at just the right age of my life. Anyway, what the point is that, we criticize the guys who have tons of money, these corporate raiders. Well, what was Gordon Gekko doing in that movie, right? You're just going in making companies more efficient. Well, what is that? That is eternal return. He's not just, how do I get money out of this company? He's like, how do we make this company better so it can continue to make more money into the future? I mean, what corporate raiders do, right? If you want to put a villain up in today's society, you put a corporate raider up there, but all they're doing is aggressive consultants. Not how do we make this company better, not how do we make this company make more money, but how do we turn this company into a thing that itself makes money for itself? It just becomes this perpetual feedback machine of productivity. I mean, I don't know if they had much of these back in Nietzsche's time, but that ends up being the exact concretization of the return of the Ubermensch mentality. You do not play the game to win. You play it to make it a good game. Now, you also play it to win, but you do it in a way that makes it a good game. When I talk about in my book, what's the freaking contribution? What are you doing? Now, you're not going to have the what's the contribution, how do I make this a good game, if you're demonizing guys like Scrooge McDuck. Now, I understand this may seem kind of silly from a certain perspective. This may seem like the seize the day speech from Dead Poets Society. But seize what? It matters what you're seizing. And without a clear picture of our psychology, you don't know what you're seizing. You don't know if what you're doing really matters. You can't just be an actor. You don't know if that's the right thing for you to do. You got to work on yourself. You have to go to a more fundamental question than, what do I want to do with my life? If you have a bunch of anxieties and resentments and you want to be an actor and your dad doesn't want you to be, like in this movie, then probably you're just doing that to get back at your dad. Could be. Now, maybe you really want to be an actor or a poet. Whatever the kid wanted to be who killed himself in this movie. But it's got to be more fundamental than that. We have to bring that this is a psychological question. So in order to answer the return, in order to live by the return in the most accurate way we know how, we have to bring the question back to a psychological issue. And obviously you know what the next two slides are going to be. Anxiety map. This is what you seize. The anger map. This is what you seize. This is what you deal in. Everything else will flow from here. Not just your life, but the lives of progeny and your culture. All right, Animus Empire, or Animus at animusempire.com, excuse me, if you have a question. And animusempire.com/schedule. Again, free 30-minute consultations. Love to hear from you guys. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for joining me. And of course, I wish you all the joy and pain that comes from being in touch with reality.